13 conferences. I'm saying so because this conference we have today, it looks like an open at what will be happening next week. And therefore, this is one of them. So we are doing practice what we've been doing. So I want to welcome all of us here to participate during the course of the conferences that we have from this week and crossing to the whole of next week. So thank you very much, Prof. Obongi, for organizing this conference. I know we have worked on it in the last 3 weeks. You just came the other day, but we have put a very good team together, and that's where we are today. So first, can I thank you so much again for coming to grace this occasion. And now, Professor Margaret wants to say this, that I am satisfied to note that this important conference brings together various standpoints by both as seasoned and budding scholars of the Mau Mau movement, in particular, and Kenyan history in general. So this is highly celebrated as a critical junction of knowledge creation and archiving. In my view, the essence of such an endeavor is no less significant, since it not only divines and recreates, but also reimagines our identities, our shared paths, and not least our life experiences. From such scholarly ventures are lessons galore for humanity in the world today, which is increasingly becoming one and more entangled than ever before. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to observe that the Department of History and Archaeology has recently been running rigorous staff seminars, and the chair has related to that, and have generated interest not only locally here, but also has been able to capture global attention, which is very important. This, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, needs to be encouraged. And therefore, this conference, in fundamental ways, constitutes a step higher in the right and admirable direction. I want to say that in any university, including this University of Nairobi, conferences are hallmarks of scholarship. They are spaces where research findings and ideas are incubated, interrogated, and disseminated, not to fault, but to allow for improvement and concretization. As the division that is in charge of research and innovation in this university, we would like to encourage such exemplary efforts as has been done by this department. Let me also observe that though this conference is organized and hosted by the Department of History and Archaeology, it has drawn participants from many disciplines, including literature, political science, journalism, sociology, religious studies, and many others indeed. This important tenet of conference, therefore, is a rich ground for cross-pollination, if we are to put it that way. And it hopefully will generate more of such engagements in the foreseeable future. Finally, I look forward to the organizers of this conference to have the papers published in order to reach a wide audience, because again, that is what we stand for. So then let it not just end here. We would like to see most of the papers being presented here, finding their way into some publication. That is very important to us as a university. Like to see in further. So thank you very much, members, as we now usher in today. Ladies and gentlemen, let me now at this point say that it is now my great pleasure and singular honor to invite the Vice Chancellor, University of Nairobi, Professor Stephen Kiama Gitai, to come to address us and to officially open this conference. Asante sana. So with a big clap again, let's invite the Vice Chancellor. Thank you very much. Vice Chancellor, karibu sana.
Yes, good morning, everyone. So this is great. You can see the room here is full, scholars, and also others are online. Yeah. So it shows there's a lot of interest in the subject you have brought, Boji, and also that this is the university, really. Yeah. Sharing this kind of discussion, and I hope through this you generate also new knowledge. Want to acknowledge you, Dean Thiambo, Jacob Thiambo, for supporting the department in this to ensure this succeeds. And all of you here gathered here, I want to acknowledge all of you. 70 years ago, this week, the body has just mentioned this, the colonial authorities declared a state of emergency in Kenya. This had both immediate and far-reaching ramifications for the colony and its people, and it continues to shape discourses many years later, including today. The Mau Mau movement itself had deep roots that marked an intensifying crisis in the colony. The declaration of emergency was a preemptive strike to decapitate the largely underground movement of its leadership. The official repression and the violence, euphemistically dubbed as counter-insurgency, ushered in a grave period in the colony that came to be known as worldwide as Mau Mau. Out of this uprising, the colonialists had to rethink their occupation. This conference is, therefore, a welcome opportunity to relive the past with a view to reflecting on the meanings of the struggles and the contradictions that issued after the declaration of emergency. The story of the Mau Mau has many trajectories that have invoked deep emotions both in the academy and in the society at large. For example, each of the key divides has a story to tell from either the so-called loyalists, sellouts, or heroes and heroines, what in our place we used to call home guards. Yeah. Or Gati. No? It further raises pertinent questions that speaks to the continued social, economic, and political emergencies in Kenya today, and how they resonate, or rather derive from the 1952 declaration. At a global level, Mau Mau clearly impacted on other liberation struggles, including the other African countries, the Caribbeans, and the American diaspora, just to mention a few. Additionally, to what extent did Mau Mau have cross-cultural influence that would be manifested in such movements as the Rastafarians? Finally, I'm not a historian myself, but I think these are some of the areas that I'm sure this conference will cover. That is, recent developments just opposed against the ideas or ideals and the aspirations of the Mau Mau, what does the evocation of Mau Mau in whatever context symbolize? Are there other species of Mau Mau, philosophies and ideology, gender politics of Mau Mau, and Mau Mau as a devoured dream? Ladies and gentlemen, in my view, all these are pointers to the contested legacy, hence the need for both national and international dialogue. I hope this conference is one of the many engagements that will speak to this novel manner. And note, for example, when you talk about the issue of gender politics and Mau Mau, I was looking at the program, didn't notice that much of it, but sharing with our parents, we know some of the things that happened during this time. And I hope that, that age group is now 85 years plus. So they are on their way out of the stage. I hope Kenny Deboji and Jack, you have time to interview those and you know exactly what they went through that time. My mother says that time she was in town in Nairobi. Yeah. She had just gotten married, quote unquote. Yeah. She had the firstborn, our elder brother. And then the state of emergency is called, and they had to be taken home. Those who remember the stories of the song, you know that song, yeah? And interestingly, she says at that time, the man, my father, had not yet introduced her to to his parents. Because she had just came here, was brought here by her elder brother, and then was introduced to her friend, Gitahi then, yeah? And they lived together and got the first child, and now she needed to be taken home, yeah. And with this taken by trucks, yeah. And the first entry was obviously the chief of the area, getting to know them. And then she mentions the father-in-law, and her father-in-law now coming to identify this person who she has never met before. Yeah. So that part of the story, yeah. And the resilience of women at that time, how they were kept in the concentration camps. And I saw the images of those concentration camps. Living together in one house, many families. And you don't know whether even this man will come from detention. Yeah. The resilience of those women, yeah, trying to survive, selling camera or yeah. The others know those things. Yeah. They had to sell some form of alcohol, yeah, to survive, yeah. And even worse, you don't know whether the man will come back, and your other brothers are starting to tell you maybe you need to move on, yeah, and not wait for this man. And then you go to the meetings called by the chiefs at that point, and they are holding a coin, that coin that had a hole in it, yeah. And they are saying, this one, you will never get one like this. You are sitting there waiting for your husbands and all that. Even this one, you will never get. And even we are getting stories about your husband, the so-called husbands, and where they are living, there is a lot of weed and the sad, and which is blowing the sad into their food. And they are getting diarrhea. Yeah? That is the report we are getting as government officers. Yeah? And many are dying. They are going to die. Yeah. So you go, she tells me, she will go to her elder brother who will say, you need to marry. I know this man with a big piece of land and coffee, and they can marry you. Don't stay there. And you know, through that, he tells me the elder sister decided actually to proceed and marry. Yeah. And was married by somebody who was running a hotel, and she lived very comfortable. She was looking very comfortable, better than her. But the interesting thing is my father now, from maternal side, my grandfather from maternal side said, no, I'm not going to receive dowry twice. I already received dowry from the man who is in detention. I'm not going to receive from you now. Yeah. And it was like that until that man who had married my aunt came back from detention. And then when he came, the father said, now is the time now to go to your husband. Yeah. Yeah. And she went back to her husband. Yeah. And what did the husband say from detention? She said, oh, I'm very grateful for this man who kept my wife. When I was in detention. And he actually even, my mother tells me, they even got some bit of clothes and all that for that man who came from detention. And he leased the wife to the true owner. Yeah. So these are realities. These are realities. I don't know, Boji, to what extent that part of the story, yeah? Because this generation is going to go with that rich information. And so that everybody can learn that gender dimension of the issues, and that you can just come back and then you get married. And they stayed together happily ever after. Yeah. So this is very important to go back to this and learn some lessons which can inform us and the generations that are living today, especially the resilience of those mothers who stayed on. And they're happy when my mother tells me, she took the correct decision to stay when she didn't know that the husband is going to come or not. Yeah. I don't know how many body would do that today. Yeah. You take a vote after the conference. Yeah, members. So this is going to be a very exciting debate, I know, from here. It is now my pleasure to declare this conference, whose theme is Recasting Mau Mau Discourse, Reflections on the Declarations of the State of Emergency, 70 years later, officially open. I wish you a very, very fruitful celebration. Asante sana, and God bless you.
The Vice Chancellor, thank you very much for those very wonderful remarks. I think I'm going to ask my colleague, Dr. Gachi, to come and interview you, because she's the Mau Mau expert in the department. And sooner, a very interesting story, oral history for that matter. We will move on to have a keynote speaker, Professor John Lonsdale. This session is going to be led by our colleague, Professor Sambai Katumang. Sambai, welcome.
our Vice Chancellor, Professor Kiama, our Dean, Professor Jack Odhiambo, and the able representative of our Deputy Vice Chancellor Research. We are humbled to have you here, more specifically in this opening session, which I shall be having the pleasure to chair. For all practical purposes, our sincere appreciation, more specifically from that historical personal history that you just related to us. Fundamental in it is essentially the ongoing debate in the public realm whether in fact units like history remain important or not. So there is a collective aspect of history which is very critical, and as you rightly mentioned, which informs essentially the dynamics and the challenges that we continue to have within our republic itself. And more reasonably for that purpose, that is why we have John Lonsdale, professor, who is going to give us a keynote address entitled The Outstanding Questions About Our Understanding of the Mau Mau, right? Why is that fundamentally important? Well, you just have to understand several factors. One, in terms of, first of all, the selection of John Lonsdale as an emeritus professor of modern history, modern African history, University of Cambridge. He obtained his PhD, of course, the same university in 1964. And of course, after 1964, he did some lecturing at the University of Dar es Salaam before returning to basically chair both the African Students Association and the Cambridge Center for African Studies. So you will notice that Professor Lonsdale served in Kenya at that particular point in time as a member of the King's African Rifles, right? So he did indeed participate in this in this drama of the Mau Mau. But more fundamentally important is the basic fact that thereafter he's done a lot of writings on this question of the Mau Mau, starting off with what I can probably present to you, one as the moral economy of the Mau Mau. But more important is, of course, the other several editions that he carried out, or rather ended up writing. I would want to possibly mention first and foremost the book he did with the Atieno Odhiambo in 2003, Mau Mau in Nationhood, Arms, Authority, and Narrations. Why that is basically important is that you then come across what we're calling the discourses of the Mau Mau, discourses that eventually become those of the political leadership in Kenya, especially the statements made by the then late Mzee Jomo Kenyatta. All of us fought for independence in our own ways, right? If you understand what that essentially means, the whole process of deconstructing and reconstructing history to favor a certain specific purpose. So one of the most interesting dynamics relative to the question, to the issues you just raised, is the whole essence of struggles and the consequences of those struggles in terms of those who end up gaining and those who don't. So it is a big, long-going struggle and issue within the Republic of Kenya. But it is this book, more specifically, the Happy Valley, that is of interest. If you haven't read it, I think you should. Why is the Happy Valley very interesting? In the sense that he writes about what is essentially a dialectical opposite. In other words, an inverse dialectical response to what was then referred to as the Happy Valley. I don't know if any of you can remember where the Happy Valley was and where it lay. So Prof. Happy Valley in the geographical construction of Kenya was in between the Aberdares Mountains, where you have what used to be called the Wanjoi Valley, and Naivasha. And it basically constituted a logic, hedonistic tendencies among what we call the white settlers, especially British, Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Irish rather, aristocrats who set up all sorts of adventures within that realm or that geography. So what was the Happy Valley was in effect the unhappy valley of the existence of people. And so what John Lonsdale tries to recapture with Bruce Berman in his 534 or so pages is a rediscussion, okay, of the wealth, poverty, and the civic virtue among the Kikuyu people, but more fundamentally, how the colonial system is constituted and how it reproduces what you then call the dependency state that emerges later on. So the contradictions inherent in these, the modes of what he calls settler capitalism, but in effect, settler predatory extraction. That's probably the best way of looking at it. And then, of course, how that leads to that necessary resistance that will then constitute what we're calling the Mau Mau, right? So the aspect about the Happy Valley would probably be a best way of going to look out for a movie that was eventually produced, the outcome of this, about the trial of a man called Jock Broughton, whose wife, Diana Broughton, had been having an affair with Captain Jocelyn Victor. And Victor gets killed or whatever, shot in between Gong and Karen. So that is a little bit of the history of this republic, the dynamics around that, whether in fact Jocelyn was a member of the Nazi, and probably that's the reason why he may have been killed, whatever, that we don't know. Probably if we asked John Lonsdale, he may be able to make a clarity of that kind of dynamic along the way. But in addition to that, we will have a response from our colleague, Professor Karoti Kanyinga. So if Lonsdale and his body are in London, of course, Lonsdale is in exile and his spirit and heart will always be over here. But the other exile from our Department of Political Science is Professor Karoti Kanyinga, who will be joining us on virtually. And Kanyinga has done a lot of work relative to ethnicity and development, devolution and development, electoral politics and development. So what is the confluence between the two of them? What is interesting is that Kanyinga will also write a very interesting book. Among the many publications he's done, one which is titled Passions and Reversals in Democratic Transitions in Kenya, a case study especially of the 2007 elections. And here he's trying to look at a number of issues, the analysis and the gaps, okay, within the gains of democracy, right? And those reversals that come along. So his major dilemma is especially in terms of these difficulties in the arrival of democracy and how, in fact, it should be measured. So what you end up having is you seem to be making 2 steps forward and several steps backward, and cycles of what you're calling electoral violence, crises in terms of governance, and all those dynamics. Probably what, as you listen to both the two of them, you may want to ask yourself, to what extent are these dynamics a function of necessarily what in political science we want to call a lame state or a state in a crisis, whatever names or whatever adjectives you essentially want to give it. And so how we basically understand elections and the mutations of exclusions, plus more specifically what Kanyinga ends up coming up with, what you call the Oxford Handbook of the Kenyan politics. So if Lonsdale and the Happy Valley are back to the construction of the colonial state, Kanyinga and others are taking us into the 1930s to the present to understand the current state in the form within which it is. So the two of them are very interesting actors. I'm not hoping that they will converge at every given point of time. I am actually hoping that you will then develop the right kind of equations, sometimes going beyond the description of the questions that we need to understand to more specifically the challenges that we have to grapple with, and whether in fact other Mau Maus will continue coming, because there is a small fundamental question we are not dealing with. And lastly, but not least, so I welcome you all in that session. The only problem is that my chairman and old friend forgot to invite Gidu Kahengeri, who is, I think, the current repository of the Mau Mau history as of now. But your sins are forgiven now that you invited others like Professor Monemi and what have you. So with those few remarks, may I welcome Professor Lonsdale. He has 40 minutes, and thereafter we'll give Kanyinga a few minutes, probably 20, and the rest of you will have enough time to discuss all these issues up until the time we break off for lunch at exactly 1 o'clock. So you're welcome to the sessions. Thank you, sir.
So, good morning to my colleagues in Nairobi. Habari ya asubuhi. It's wonderful to be able to return to Nairobi, if only have so many friends. And I throw myself particularly on the mercy of Karuti Kanyinga, who will be to say, because many years ago, I was his examiner for his PhD at Roskilde, but I did at least pass you, so I hope I shall pass as well in what I have to say. I'd like to start by congratulating my friend Kenneth Ombongi for your courageous initiative and the hard work, of course, of all your colleagues in putting this important conference together. And thank you for giving me the honor of putting forward a few ideas by way of a keynote. I hope participants will find them sufficiently provocative, and I hope I can be heard. So, what's new, or what's fairly new? I have in mind two developments in historiography. First, historians nowadays increasingly aspire to write with an eye to global history, no matter how local their own interests are, how unknown their local heroes and villains may be to the rest of the world. We try increasingly, I think, to see lives lived in layers, in regional, national, continental, and global layers. As historians, we try to catch up with what we think finance, trade, imperialism, migration, and the internet have created, which is a globalized world. But of course, that world has existed as long as humankind. After all, human beings, all human beings, myself included, are African by origin. Africans colonized the world many centuries before Google and TikTok. So there's nothing very much new, I think, in our trying to look for globalized insights into local history. So, but I do think we must increasingly look for our understandings of Mau Mau, its origins, its aims and actions, its successes and failures, its allies and opponents, its consequence, its memory, in several layers, if we are to get a richer understanding of its world historical significance. But the second development in historiography is something called, I think, postmodernism or postcolonialism. I'm far too old to understand it properly myself, but I think one of the new school's tenets, particular peoples can be fully understood only by scholars of that particular identity. If that is so, if I've got that right, then I can't myself possibly understand Mau Mau, can I? And your chairman ought not to have invited me, but he did. So I will feel able to put my questions. I'm going to put 4 of them, only 4. There are masses more that people will want to ask, of course. And the questions that I want to ask have been asked and answered many times before, but old questions can always provoke new answers, which is what I shall try to suggest to you this morning. And of course, there are lots of other questions that members of the conference will want to ask, not least the question of gender, on which I have almost nothing to say, but I should. In brief, then, I want to ask the following 4 questions. First, I want to ask questions about historians and their historiography, which is, of course, an extremely disputatious field nowadays, to do with the authenticity and identity of scholars. Can we claim to understand people who are not like us? Who has the right to speak for whom? And I think more importantly, under what conditions of civil liberty can historians ask and answer and research these questions? So that's my first question. My second question is another very technical historian's question about our sources and their translation. How far can we trust the sources on which we rely for our understanding of Mau Mau? Thirdly, perhaps rather more importantly for Kenyans, was Mau Mau's fight for colonial freedom also a Kikuyu civil war? Or did British counterinsurgency force civil war upon the Kikuyu? That question invites one to assess the relative importance of history and geopolitics. How does one weigh past Kikuyu history against the geopolitics of British decolonization and its concern to keep Africa safe for the West during the Cold War? Two very different questions, I think, and one has to weigh the balance between them. Fourthly and finally, questions of war and peace. Across the world, I think, historians of war are increasingly asking how far the conduct and results of war then shape the way in which peace is subsequently negotiated. So what sort of peace, what sort of Kenya did the Mau Mau War create? How far was Mau Mau responsible for Kenya's particular form of independence? At a time, we must remember, looking globally, when peaceful African independences were already on the way elsewhere. So those are my four questions. Now let me try to explore them in more detail. First of all, then, historians and their historiography. Why has Dr. Kenneth Ombongi so kindly asked me, an ex-imperialist rather than an ex-freedom fighter, to give this keynote address? Moreover, as the Vice-Chancellor so kindly pointed out, people involved in the emergency, and I served during the emergency, are a generation on their way out, the 85 and plus, amongst whom I number. So thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for reminding me of this. But how can a retired second lieutenant of the King's African Rifles be trusted to understand Mau Mau? Admittedly, I never fired a shot in anger. And when I arrived in 1956, the army had already been withdrawn from the Forest War, so I took no part in it at all, fortunately. However, there were no Kikuyu in my platoon. All my askari were either Kalenjin, Kamba, Luo, Samburu, Somali, or Turkana. So what on earth can I know? What did they know? Or what can historians from Western Kenya, or to echo Professor Oriambo, what can historians from Kavirondo know about Mau Mau? Why is it that Kikuyu historians of Mau Mau have tended to emerge only rather recently, quite a long time after their pioneer, Tabitha Kanogo? Does a historian's identity actually matter? If it does matter, then how blind have we non-Kikuyu historians been? And I think we have to lift that question from the personal to the political. As has already been remarked, Kenyan historians generally felt silenced by political oppression in the last quarter of the 20th century. Ngugi wa Thiong'o would say that that was because a then tyrannical Kenyan state was frightened by Mau Mau's radical message. If so, and if I've understood the postmodern turn correctly, did the state's suppression of Mau Mau memory allow only historians who could never understand it to write its history? Because of course, by and large, we were not Kenyans writing from elsewhere. We were free to do so. Kenyans were not. And I simply don't know whether that's a silly question or a serious question. But in either case, and however you answer it, the human rights of historians are clearly hugely important to the kind of history that we feel able to research and to write. After a long struggle, British historians, one of whom is listening in now, were unable to unearth the secret colonial archive known as the Hanslope deposit, and so exposed the dirty side of a once proud imperialism. Could Kenyan historians do the same? Is there a secret Kenyan archive? What questions about Mau Mau would Kenyan questions like to ask but still feel unable to do so? So that's my first set of questions. Second, sources and their translation, which I find extremely worrying. Most memoirs of Mau Mau were written by people who knew little English. They were translated by people who knew even less Kikuyu. How worrying is that? I'll give just two disturbing examples, or examples which I find disturbing, reserving a third, a still more intriguing question to the end. My first question relates to the memoir of General China Waryuhu Itote. He writes that he is translated as writing, that he set up his military base on the slopes of Mount Kirinyaga and gave it the name Thingira ya Iregi. He must have deliberately chosen that title for its revolutionary connotations. In his mind, the Thingira ya Iregi was the young men's hut of a rebellious generation. But how is that translated? As, I quote, the cottage of the ancestors. Well, to my mind, and certainly to any English readers, the cottage of the ancestors would suggest a couple of charming old folks at their door, surrounded by roses creeping up the wall, not rebellious youth. A totally contradictory image to the one which I think Waryuhu Itote intended. And I just wonder how many other similar mistranslations there are in our sources. The so-called Mau Mau Nyimbo are my second example. There are two translations available to us, totally different from each other. One is used by Bethwell Ogot in his article in Hadith on the revolt of the elders. Totally different versions are given to us by Kenyati in his Thunder from the Mountains. Totally opposite in political sentiment. So, which does one go for? How far can we trust any of our sources? Now, the man who taught me medieval European history at Cambridge many years ago now, Walter Ullmann, who was an Austrian refugee from Hitler's Nazis, openly admitted that many of the documents he used to uncover mostly legal charters written by monks in monasteries were actually forgeries, paid for by people who wanted their own case to be known, forgeries. But he knew how to use them. Do we have to practice the same sort of skills? If so, how? So that's my second question. Thirdly, and as I say, more importantly, perhaps for Kenyans, the question of what was Mau Mau, the relationship between colonial freedom and civil war. And as I suggested briefly earlier, this in what seems a relevant past should we look for causes, and in how wide a context should we look in order to understand processes? There are doubtless other questions you will want to put. First, then, between what I call deep history and the possibility of war amongst a dissident group. And I go back to 1938, when some elders who were recruited by Senior Chief Koinange wa Mbiu told Louis Leakey, the so-called white African, born at Kabete in 1903, that the women, they told him that the women men dance the Kibata dance preparatory to Itwika, that Kikuyu ritual of generational transition, that the women sang the chorus, tread, tread all arrogance into the ground. Tread all arrogance into the ground, which suggests that Kikuyu culture both respected and resented arrogant social hierarchy amongst themselves, as perhaps all social cultures do, taking the global view again. So while, as I understand it, in Kikuyu culture, generous wealth was wisdom, Indo ni Kihoto, selfish wealth was sorcery, arrogance to be trod into the ground. And every 30 years or so, a new generation, the Irungu straighteners, were expected to kuura, to cleanse or redeem the land from their father's greedy rivalry, and so on. Now, this indigenous moral economy, this moral ethnicity, as I've called it, was further angered, of course, in the colonial period by the rural capitalism that both colonial chiefs and others practiced at the expense of their clients, formerly ahoy of some sort. And squatters, Athikwota, similarly were outraged when their settler patrons turned against them after the Second World War. So how far did Mama initially have to act as a kind of moral cleansing by a new generation of Irungu within Kikuyu society before their anger could be turned outwards to confront colonial oppression? I have, in the moral economy of Mama, as mentioned, suggest that may have been the case. So have others, including most recently the Kikuyu scholar Muoki Munga, who's written the most interesting thesis in the United States. If so, if we're right in this, such social cleansing of patrimonial treachery was also, of course, very complicated by the politics between Mbari and their sovereignties, such as lay behind the Lari massacre. But is it not always the case, again looking globally, that revolt divides a given society internally before its domestic dissidents are able to turn and attack the external sources of injustice? There's nothing remarkable about Mama, it seems to me, if that is the case. We should treat it as totally normal. And perhaps it would be worthwhile for Kenyan historians to make studies of other revolts around the world and to tease out what. But there is the alternative, of course, that the British forced civil war on the Kikuyu by the violence and sheer ignorance, as I think, of the counterinsurgency. Did this counterinsurgency, this external force instant panicky decisions of Kikuyu who sought safety one way or the other, with little time to ponder what might be the injustices and divisions of their own past? War is in any case an inherently and often unpredictably divisive process. In Kenya, perhaps especially in the realms of detention and forced villagization. And what about the geopolitics of this ignorant and forceful counterinsurgency? I think the violence of counterinsurgency, one must at least ask, and I think probably was, prompted as much by a British concern damaging global potential in world politics in the era of the Cold War, as it was stimulated by white settler fear and anger. That Mama was a Russian proxy and Jomo Kenyatta, a communist fellow traveler, were for a time being, I think, genuine British beliefs. And such a red global threat simply had to be defeated if Kenya and Africa were to be decolonized safely within the Western orbit. And I have a subsidiary question here. I mean, how much did the British understand Kikuyu at all? How far did they know which divisions they could exploit at the start of the emergency? Divisions, of course, appeared during the course of the war. They were made to appear. Before I end looking at this aspect of my questions, I'm very much intrigued by the fact that Dedan Kimathi shared the same geopolitical breadth of vision as the British. After all, he compared Mau Mau to Ho Chi Minh's Viet Minh insurgents fighting against French imperialism in what was still called Indochina. Does his global perspective suggest we should look more closely at the way in which a general Kenyan African consciousness of the rest of the world was itself a source of radical discontent for many years before Mau Mau? After all, Harry Thuku was writing to Marcus Garvey, that black African, well, he was Jamaican, leader of African American opinion in New York. Harry Thuku was writing to him as early as 1921, over a century ago. And 7 years thereafter, Kenyatta, as editor of the journal Muiguzania, was urging Kikuyu to work hard to imitate the Maoris of New Zealand, unlike what he thought to be the idle native Australians. How did he know about the Maoris and native Australians? Kenyan Africans knew a lot about the world long before I think many of us might suspect that they did. And Mau Mau leaders, of course, reminded their Itangati that centuries before them, the children of Israel had taught them how to suffer and to win. What new understandings might we find in remembering that both the British and Mau Mau had their eye on the world and world history beyond Kenya? Finally, war and peace. Historians of war, as I've said, increasingly interested in finding out how the conduct and results of war actively shaped the peace that was negotiated thereafter, who got what and at whose expense. What new questions should we ask about how the character of the Mau Mau War affected the peace? The peace, that is, which was the political negotiations that led to Kenya's independence. And these are very for Kenyans to ask. How important was it, not only to the British, but also to other Kenyan nationalists, that Mau Mau must be defeated before there could be serious negotiations over independence? These are clearly, as I say, very delicate questions. Did Mau Mau bring Kenya's independence? Or did that owe more to Kwame Nkrumah on the other side of the continent and to Julius Nyerere next door and his TANU's overwhelming victory in the election of 1958, after which the British simply had to leave, leaving Kenya exposed? Did Mau Mau achieve something rather more limited, which was to secure African majority rule rather than some fancy multiracial constitution with perhaps as Prime Minister, Kenyatta as Attorney General? Or could that multiracial have been engineered given the racial arithmetic, as Maudling, the Secretary of State for the Colonies, complained? Would there have to have been African majority rule in Kenya with or without Mau Mau? Kenya's independence, in fact, an anti-Mau Mau peace settlement? Kenya with the GSU, the Kenya for Majimbo, of loyalist rule? I don't know whether there are. But to conclude, important for Kenyans. I don't think Kenyans should be surprised or embarrassed by these questions. Long ago, Carl Rosberg, the American political scientist, and John Nottingham, I believe known as that good DC, sympathized with Mau Mau and argued against the myth of its barbarism in their book, The Myth of Mau Mau. Still hugely worth reading. But, and it's an important but, they also warned that while a minority could win power, it might also be the worst way to try to build a nation. But the paradox has been true of many modern nations, again, looking globally, not just at Kenya by itself. I think it would be worthwhile for Kenyans to read one of my favorite historians, and he can be read in translation, the Frenchman, Ernest Renan, who in 1882 in Paris gave a lecture on what is a nation. Qu'est-ce que c'est une nation? For he concluded that almost all existing nations had been constructed by civil war, internal civil war. So he thought that national pasts were so dangerously divisive that they ought to be forgotten. Citizens should forget the way in which their forefathers fought each other if they were to respect each other and their democracy. I personally prefer the view of my mwalimu, Mzee Bethwel Ogot, blessings be upon him, that all pasts should be openly confronted and openly discussed and reconciled. And the choice between Renan's forgetfulness and Ogot's active is perhaps the greatest outstanding question 70 years on for Kenyans to decide. Unless there is a still greater question, our sources and problems of cultural identity and understanding. What did Jomo Kenyatta mean when in August 1952, on the Kiambu cricket pitch, with microphone in hand, he condemned Mau Mau to Miri ya Mikangoi? Did he really curse it to endless oblivion, as he did some years later with precisely the same formula he cursed Bildad Kagia? Or, to the contrary, was he, as my other mwalimu, Mzee Godfrey Muriuki, believes, along with Louis Leakey and Judge Ransley Thacker, was Kenyatta in fact giving Mau Mau very friendly and very crafty advice to act with still greater secrecy and greater effectiveness by going underground? Much depends on your answer. Thank you.
Wherever you are, we are patiently waiting to hear from you. Professor Kanyinga, wherever you are. Karibu sana.
Yes, I can hear you. Should I proceed? Yeah, good morning, everyone.
Please proceed.
Thank you very much, Sabai. Thank you very much, Professor John Lonsdale, and thank you very much, everyone else who is here. Mzambai Katumanga, I'm not in exile. I'm sorry. I had classes in the morning, and I thought if I were to drive from here to the university, I would be ready to listen to this important speech, opening remarks by John. And thank you very much, John. It's been a while. I think you did mention very well that you actually examined me.
I passed
when
you.
when you passed me many years ago when I was young. Let me go straight to this very important presentation that you have made. And I think for students of history, students of political science, I must admit a number of things that come to mind when you listen to these 4 questions that Professor John Lonsdale is raising here. The first of them is what has got the understanding of Mau Mau got to do with our present day Kenyan society? When you look at the questions that Professor John Lonsdale is raising, they pose quite a number of new insights, including is the Kenyan society, what do we make of the Kenyan society today that we would say is actually the result of the type of war and peace that came after the Mau Mau period. Now, the second issue that comes out, and I think we need to start asking our younger historians and political science and political sociologists paying attention to, is what did Mau Mau and the way the insurgency was resolved, what kind of society did it create? And here I think when I listened to John Lonsdale's question of whether the Mau Mau was actually creating a civil war within the Kikuyu community, or the civil war was created by the British themselves, then we realize that the class dimension of the Kenyan society has origins in how that particular situation, Mau Mau conflict was resolved. Because among other things, what we see is the fact that Mau Mau itself was not against the colonial administration. It was an uprising to demand for a new order of our society. It was seeking, if I go to John Lonsdale's argument, it was an organization to develop a new order of the world in Kenya. And actually, when you look at the presentation and the fact that the Mau Mau were interacting with the other leaders in different parts of the world, leaders who are concerned about creating a new world order, then you realize that Mau Mau were not the type of people that Kenyatta called Imaramari, because I think if you look at your works, the 1952 meeting is where Kenyatta also called the Mau Mau Imaramari, meaning vagabonds or layabouts or laissez-fallers, or useless people, if I can say that, right? Now, if you look at that, then you need to say that, yes, the Mau Mau were much more about a moral ethnicity and moral economy of the society, as opposed to what the Kenyattas and other groups of elites at that particular time wanted to construct as a new world order. If you look at your other question, then one can say that one can understand clearly the type of class divisions that were emerging and were giving rise to Mau Mau itself, because Mau Mau was interacting with the outer world, an outer world where there were similar individuals, similar groups that were concerned about in the world and oppression by different groups of regimes outside, Marcus Garvey and others. were concerned about the same things that Mau Mau were concerned within the Kenyan society. Your second question is much more interesting, and I think this is where we need people like George Gona. I know he's a man who sleeps in the archives, and Gashege, they sleep in the National Archives. And I think this is the time we start asking ourselves whether we should not be paying attention to the translation of some of the materials through which we have known how Mau Mau is, and or other movements of the time. Actually, it has never occurred to me that the translation, the one you have cited, means very different things, and therefore leads to a very different type of knowledge. Nonetheless, the sources of translation and how they are translated also raises a very different way of making knowledge. Sometimes the materials that we have in our national archives are very different, and I'm saying this from the benefits of reading John Kamau's works, are very different from what one would get in the British museums, in the British archives, right? So what kind of knowledge are we exposed about to with regard to different layers of sources of information about a phenomena that we really have in our space here? The relationship of these sources of knowledge and the type sources of material we have on Mau Mau and the type of knowledge we have them, I would like to make a proposal, are probably the reason why we have not kept the fire on Mau Mau, understanding Mau Mau, burning throughout. Because for the last 60 years, I can say without a doubt, there is no single national holiday that we don't have a newspaper talking about Mau Mau. Why is it that 60 years later, we talk about Mau Mau as if it has never been resolved, as if the problems facing the Mau Mau leaders, their families, are. Why is it that no single successive government in this country has never said that we want to pay attention to the Mau Mau families and the issues that they were talking about to bring them to the conclusion? I think the Vice Chancellor knows far much better. He comes from Nyeri, is a product of those particular kind of environment. Why is it that we, every time in the last 60 years, every public holiday, Kenyans are put into this spine of saying we are remembering the Mau Mau, and the only thing we give them are the medals. In other words, what has made us forget about the need to compensate, if not to compensate, the need to remember Mau Mau in a much more better, positive manner than we have done as a country? Are we a country that forgets about its heroes and heroines because they never laid a foundation strong enough for the future? Or is it simply because we've been taught by the archives and the materials that have been translated that this is not important? What makes us our memories that we can forget about the need to pay attention to the society that the Mau Mau are looking forward to than what we have done at present? I would like to ask just very personal questions, but for the benefit of younger students here. If John Lonsdale were to come back to Kenya today in his 30s, what would he be standing about the Mau Mau that he did not study before? What is it that you'd say, this is what I did not pay attention to, and I would like to start paying attention to it? That's one. If Mau Mau were to wake up today, what do you think they would be fighting for? And what is it that they would fight over? Will they lose hope? Will they join other groups in the society? Looking at Kenya today from what Musambai said, we are in exile, and I'm also in exile. If Mau Mau were to wake up today, what would frustrate them most? Is there anything that they would be happy about? Let me pause there and say that those are questions that probably we need to pay attention to. And finally, I'm surprised at the extent to which we have not discussed the land question in our usual way of looking at it. And I would like to say that maybe you need to give a note on the three questions, and especially the land question and its relationship to question in Kenya, because I believe it's the land question and the question of access to land that made the Mau Mau seek to create a different type of society than what most of the literature has been tending to make us believe. Let me stop there and say this was a very exciting keynote address, and thank you very much again, John, for this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Karuti. Could I just very briefly try to respond to your two questions? First, what new understandings would I have, and what might Mau Mau think of present-day Kenya? I'm very struck by the example that Kara Moskowitz, in her recent book, a very nice book, on seeing like a citizen, very intrigued by her example of Paul Bitok, who, as a landless man, felt was not really a proper citizen and really shouldn't vote. And only when he managed to acquire some land did he feel that he was a proper citizen of Kenya. And I do wonder how far the old cultural honor surrounding property and wealth is not still, in some ways at least, exercise some kind of a dampening effect on of the poor, the unpropertied, to feel properly part of society. Now, that may be sheer ignorance on my part, that I still feel that one can ask that kind of question. So I don't know how empowered former Mau Mau would feel if they were themselves landless. Of course, the land question is a two-edged business, isn't it? First, the British seized land, not only, of course, from the Kikuyu, but also from Kalenjin and Ma-speaking pupils in the Rift Valley. Obviously, a huge source of discontent, of outrage, a search for justice in Kenyan politics. The other, less easily confronted question of the way in which, by sheer hard work, by hard labor, by kuna, by first clearance, squatters themselves gained the right to colonize parts of Kenya that Kikuyu had not previously settled. And that raises, of course, all sorts of very difficult questions indeed. And I think one land question has obviously created another, and is, I think, easily answered.
Thank you very much, John, and over to you, Sambai Katumanga.
Notion that in fact this was a civil war. So to presuppose that in fact the Mau Mau war was a civil war within the Kikuyu society, I would want to suppose as historians you're trying to tell us that in fact, Kikuyus agreed with the colonial system. Now, to the extent that that is not necessarily true, actually it isn't, then we cannot actually argue that Mau Mau was a civil war. And two, there's a question which Kanyinga alluded to as he was finishing up his remarks, which I think is far much more fundamental than anything else. And this is the question of land. And one would suppose that that more than anything did indeed still shapes the Kenyan politics today. So let's assume a situation within which somebody comes and appropriates, or rather alienates 5 million hectares of land. And out of it, the successor elite is only able to redistribute 1 million. And the politics around which that process is taking place is also as doubtful as it can be. How does that then shape what one would want to call a strategic culture that exists, especially in the successor political elite? So if we're asking ourselves the question, what is the effect of the Mau Mau? One is to basically assume that all the people who actually fought this war are long gone. The fact of the matter is that they live miserable lives, the ones that are remaining, which in fact is a reflection of the society that we have today. And so the fundamental question, how that in fact ends up shaping the case of how the Kenyan military will then respond to the shifter crisis will in fact inform the strategic culture that exists within the institutions of security today. So I would want to put back to both the two interlocutors on the same, and probably lastly ask the historians themselves a very simple question. One, in terms of how a French scholar by the name Paul Ricard talks about the question of the past not being sealed. And the whole essence of historians is how it is restituted permanently by new data that comes along the way to then reshape our reality. So could that then be the direction you should in fact be going in trying to re-examine whether that question, if Mau Mau was about freedom and land, which constitutes the essence of a statehood or a nationhood, the fact that others doubt that the nation has existed or is in existence is a function of the fundamental question of that land issue. So let's have the first two. I'll begin with my former dean, and then the chairman of the department, and then we'll come to. Okay.
Musambai, can I? Musambai.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Professor Lonsdale. That was an insightful presentation. But there's an issue that you seem to move around and talk about, but not hit the nail on the head. And that is Kenyatta. In 1952, he made a statement which he repeated in 1963. It was about the Mau Mau. And that probably is the beginning of the suppression of the Mau Mau and their non-representation in the political arena. That from 1963, there was an attempt to ensure that their role is suppressed, probably for unity. Actually, that is the reason. But how does this now shape our understanding of the Mau Mau and what followed about those species during Independence Days, that they are mentioned without anything further? They are given medals without further reparation. Would that be what Kenyatta intended from 1952? Thank you.
Should I answer? Gosh, what a question. I think you yourself have, of course, given part of the answer that myself would make, and that is his desire for unity and the undesirability, therefore, of making special measures for particular people. one must also remember that if it's true, Fred Kubai threatened to kill Kenyatta. An attempt was made on his life in detention in Lokitong. The Land Freedom Army threatened to kill him in 1961. So it's not only a question of what Kenyatta thought of Mau Mau, but what Mau Mau thought of Kenyatta. I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me that it's a question that needs to be asked.
Thank you very much, Professor Lonsdale. As my teacher, I'm a little bit fearing to ask this, but you'll agree with me that at times the hunter becomes the hunted. Now, Prof, I teach critical philosophy of history to my students here, and I also teach research methodology. And from your thoughts on the influence of the identity of a historian in what he writes, you have complicated my life a little bit because my students will ask me issues that touch on historical objectivity. I agree with you on the interface between the identity of the historian and what they write. Where does that leave the notions of historical objectivity, which we always emphasize to our students? You know very well, I'm sure, Prof, that for a long time, the Department of History and Archaeology here, and I'm glad Professor Macharia is here, my teacher of methodology, we couldn't discuss the issue of Mau Mau the way we are doing today without necessarily creating divisions within the department, Prof. Where that does leave historical objectivity, Prof? Thank you very much.
I think it leaves historical objectivity where it belongs, which is nowhere. I don't think there can, I don't know how you would define historical objectivity. As Kuruti Kanyinga pointed out, there is the question of the politics of knowledge. Everybody, it seems to me, speaks from a particular point of view. We try to understand the motivations and actions of others. We try to sympathize with why they acted as they did. We try to understand, but it seems to me that all human activity is motivated personally, subjectively. We all have our own objectivities which are not shared by others. And it seems to me that historians simply have to admit to this difficulty, to put questions to our students. Which do you think are the more important questions to ask? Who do you think ought to answer them? And to individual judgment, as must always be the case, as to what kind of conclusion one reaches. I don't see how one can possibly escape to some mythical country called objectivity. I think it's a mistake to think that such a situation exists. I think one should look to history for the that other people have made, the successes they've made and why, and look to it not for, but as guides to action. Sorry to have disappointed you.
We can't get the speaker. We can't get what he's saying.
The second thing, which I think you bring to focus and also Kanyinga brings to focus, but you don't nail it down, is why has the previous governments in Kenya not addressed the Mau Mau issue? It also looks, when you analyze the presentations and also when you read about the Mau Mau and also something about the Kenyan independence, is that it is very clear that the home guards became the elites and replaced the Mau Mau in their respective areas, the people who are DOs, who are serving the colonial government, because, and also working with the missionaries, because they had unequal access to education, to church and administration. They seem to have gotten the benefits. And it was therefore in their best interest to suppress the concerns of the Mau Mau. We have seen this rise later in form of Mungiki, or you can even ask yourself today, why is it that the county governments in areas where the Mau Mau was localized are not even making attempts to address the Mau Mau issue? Thank you.
I don't know whether that was a question addressed to me. I didn't hear, I'm afraid, what the speaker said initially. So I'm slightly at a loss to answer it. If that question was addressed to me, it seems to me it's probably more addressed to your Kenyan colleagues.
The speaker, well, sir, he sought to understand, first of all, whether in fact you had what you call a nation state in Kenya in the first place, and whether in fact the responses of the Mau Mau weren't driven by the specific interests of land, which had nothing to do with those in places, say, for instance, Kavirondo for that particular matter, if I understood him well, please.
Sorry, am I expected to answer? I mean, I simply fall back on my references to Renan and Bethwell Ogot. It seems to me that either one forgets and one shouldn't, I don't think, particularly because it would create so much injustice, or else somehow, and I don't know how, these questions must be honestly addressed. But the question is, can they ever be? Everybody has their self-interest at heart. And there are too many self-interests, it seems to me, likely, to make such a historical debate really very difficult and possibly very dangerous. But does that mean covering up injustice? These are very difficult questions, which I think Kenyans have to answer, not a retired imperialist.
Karuti, are you still there?
Yeah.
Want to
yes, I'm there.
Wait a minute.
Yes,
two more questions and then respond to that. So just hold your guns for a second, please.
Okay. Okay.
Yes. Very well. I just thought that the question of land that Kanyinga raised is something that people need to reflect on, whether it is a later construction. It was actually the thing that provoked what we had. We know that at independence, when the people say about the voting, they say that Kenyatta got the soil and the other one voted for Ugali or something. But it could be just that it was just those political elites that were trying to construct that the issue was about land. I think we here there's also the issue to do with the World War. What we hear the issue of the group of 40 and how they came and they were not integrated in the community, they were not supported, and therefore converted to the people who began the war. There are other aspects of taxation where everybody was supposed to pay tax, and therefore, if you did not have money to pay tax, you are made to do forced labor to raise money, and the people started revolting. So there are various dimensions because in Nyeri, for example, I don't think there was a lot of that displacement. The displacement you find it is allowed this in Kiabu, but yet it is where the people moved to Abadeas and moved and to fight. Yeah. So that history need to be dug properly so that it is understood what it is. Because as Johnson is saying, that it depends on which material you are reading. It depends on who is a historian, who is writing, and they can construct anything. I think that history need to be eaten. What you hear and what we know, what we hear from the ground, because we are brought by parents who are involved in this, yeah, and those people started taking oaths, etc., to begin fighting, and decided they are not going to tell. And it wasn't, when you listen, I don't hear any of them talking about the issue of blood. In fact, when Kenyatta now came in, he started to offer them land. And you know, there were people who offered land in Lamu, yeah? Those who are in Pakatoni, and you hear even some of them immediately say they refused that land to be offered land, because that was actually not the issue, the discontent. So that it is time now to write that history, to know the correct history. Last day, you know, recently I attended the play on Gahi Kadeda, I marry when I want, by Gogo Adiongo and Gogo Amelie, yeah. And that play could not be performed in this country for many years. It is just the other day that it could be allowed to be performed. And you know what Gogo put is that in other writings, that when many times they used to be chased by the rains from this Cameredo, but he emphasized that this time they were chased by the police. Yeah. But today people can be able to talk about that openly, and when you listen to it, you know why Kenyatta now disrupted it. You know, because they were talking about that butter factory. They brought machines. The only thing they brought machines were the machines. The other things were, now they would emit bad smells from the leather. They would be forced labor. They would sell the gumboots to the workers and get money from them. There was nothing else they brought except the machines. And the people came out worse after the machines were brought. But now Kenyans are able to listen to this, Boji. So that's why now it is possible to debate this issue of Mau Mau and to get the truth of it. Yeah, all those things you read, sometimes we know that they are not true. Yeah. And I agree with the questions that were being posed by the main speaker. Asante sana. Yes.
It is still good morning. No, good afternoon. Yeah, myself, I'm not a historian, and but I wanted to visit, to come and attend these presentations. These are really good presentations. Very, very interesting, because I was in Marsabit for 2 years in detention. My name is Olola Oneko, one of the Kapenguria 6. I'm not a Chingoneko, I'm his son. He's long gone. But what interests me is that when the question which was being asked, what would the Mau Maus do if they woke up today? Because most of them are gone. How they look at the whole scenario. I think that most of them will just go back to Abadeas, simply because they will be still landless, and they fought for that land at that time. In 1952, as you are saying, yeah, Jomo Kenyatta aired his view about the Mau Mau. Later, then came what came 1963. 1963, they were suppressed. So if you ask this question of, you know, what would the Mau Maus do if at all they are today with us? These people will still go back to, they will go back to Abadeas, they will go back to wherever they were, even here in Nairobi. Because at that time in 1952, when these people were being arrested, the professors just said that his mom was taken back to Nyeri. Myself and my two brothers were taken back to Kisumu. Yeah, I was still there. I was already there. So, and the reason why all the governments, those governments which have been there, have never talked about the Mau Mau or debated is simply because, yeah, most of them were the home guards. Thank you.
Accept our salutations on behalf of your father, but in effect, you've answered our colleagues the question he was asking. So you can see very clearly that Mau Mau was not what it has been painted to be as an ethnic. You can see this man from Nyanza is a consequence of those kind of Mau Mau-like violence. 3 years.
Can I just very briefly say to Mr. Oneko, hello, Omera.
My name is Givachi Agato. I'm an artist. And I think from the provocations by the first speaker, which I think were very, very deep and very important, I feel that there are two very close statements that he made for me that were very provocative. And I think they be the basis of what I'm going to say. One, he made a statement that the granting of independence was actually an anti-Mau Mau strategy. You know, the colonial government actually, by granting independence, was to kill Mau Mau. It meant something like that. The second very important statement that came out, I think, from Professor Kanyinga, is the concept of a world outlook by the Mau Mau. What is the world outlook? What was, and this is the debate that seemed to have given very diverse directions to, and nobody seems to be agreeing. What was the world outlook of the Mau Mau? And this is why the issues of land, whether it is land, whether it was wages, what it was property, what it is. What was the world? This question the historians have not dealt with. And they have not dealt with because it is the fundamental question that was raised 30 years before in 1922 by Harry Duku. Through the KCA, through the struggle in the urban centers. They were still talking about the same things, either issues of land, issues of freedom, even wages in the urban centers and so forth, 30 years before. And by the way, it is 100 years since 1922, and nobody's remembering that. But the very interesting thing is, if the Mau Mau were to arise today, they will not be asking for reparations, my goodness. They'll be asking about their world outlook. Do I have land? Do I have a proper standard of living? Am I living like an animal, or am I living like an ordinary human being with respect and dignity? That is the question that was being fought for. The land issue is the land question is all over the world. Every human being in the world fights for land. His land, motherland. People always talk about motherland. But even the people who, the trade unionist workers, the link of the trade union workers and the Mau Mau, that's an area that we have not talked about. The other struggles that are taking place as the Mau Mau took arms and the civil war in Central Province, how was it related to the other areas of like the the trade unionist movement, and which was still very active and supporting. That's how, like, Oneko comes in from a totally different cultural background, but they were linked by the world outlook. And this is fundamentally why it was possible to get rid of Mau Mau in 1963, because those who came into power had a totally different world outlook. Their ideals and their fulfillment and what they considered to be their freedom was totally different. And if you remember, I think, you historians should know better than me, I don't know. Let me make a statement that I have no proof. And I think probably this is why Pinto died, because he was leading the group that was questioning what KANU, which was coming in with a totally different outlook, was a betrayal to the Mau Mau. The outlook. And please, historians, let us not deal with things that are just unnecessary. The most important thing is the life. What life do I want to live? And that is the basic outlook, the world outlook that we should be talking about. Has it changed? Are we still in the struggle for food? Are we still in the struggle for land? The most sensitive issue in Kenya today, touch land. Touch people's land today, and utaona. It is the same thing. Touch people's wages. People are still crying for wages, proper wages. People are still crying for dignity. People are going away killed all over and going away. They're still crying for the same thing. So we have not changed. And I think that is the basic question as we honor Mau Mau struggle. It is, are we still in the same state of emergency?
Would you like to make an intervention? Then we get back to Prof, and then we pick the next set of interventions, please. There, Karuti.
Thank you very much. Let me first of all look at the land question. I can see Professor Kiama has paid attention to it, and I think the way he has posed it is the way we would always like to imagine the land question in this country, and observe that the land question in this country is not uniform. There are different questions in every part of the country, but all those questions that are asked about the land question are usually political, because the land question is generated by political forces. In fact, there is a lot of work done by people like Mike Neocosmos in the Southern African region, and people like Mamdani next door Uganda here, where they argue that in every agrarian society, the structure of land ownership is equivalent to the structure of distribution of political power. That is, if we want to understand whether Kenyan society is democratic or not, we have got to look at the structure of land ownership, because it is in the structure of land ownership where we look at issues of access and therefore food security. It's in the issue of how land ownership is structured where you see whether the society is equal or not. Now, I'm raising that question because of the way Professor Ouma raised it in terms of why is it that the Mau Mau question has never been resolved? If you look at it that way, then we need also to ask ourselves, how much have we resolved the land question in spite of how varied it is across the country? At the coast, the land question is very different from what you have in Luo Nyanza. What you have in Luo Nyanza is very different from what you have in Kisii as a land question. But why is it that the land question keeps on recurring? It keeps on recurring because of what Mau Mau were raising on the question of political power. And I think that's something else we need to start thinking about. The Mau Mau were not only interested in the world outlook question of inequality only, but you also address the question of distribution of political power and the question of social justice. Now, I'm raising that because we sometimes tend to think that Mau Mau were inward looking. But if you look at the works of John Lonsdale, you'll see that there is an extent to more interested in a moral society, the moral economy, as opposed to political tribalism. And I dare say that I would like to say with a lot of conviction that Mau were much more concerned about the inequality that was coming as a result of the colonial states, the appropriation of the state for accumulation purposes, the appropriation of the state infrastructure by the chiefs and other loyalists at the expense of the poor, and creating class differences on its own created new divisions that the Mau became increasingly opposed. But I'm going back to the question of by Professor Ouma. There is a very interesting Mamdani, I think in 1989, I can't remember, John, where he talks about the defeat of the nationalistic coalitions across Africa. That the nationalistic coalitions, every time they posed questions of change and democracy, they would be hijacked by conservative forces, and that would be the end of the story. And I think that's what could have happened even to the Mau Mau, and that's why we never respond to the question of Mau Mau with any seriousness, and that's why I don't think we are much more keen to address the question of distribution of political power, for which the Mau Mau were very much concerned about. Because even if you look at their world outlook, discussions with Marcus Garvey, Aribuku's commentaries to the outer world, they were all much more concerned about a better world, where political power is accessed for purposes of social justice, not creating class structures and inequalities that are simply oppressive. Let me stop there and say that I'll come in if there is any other question. But thank you very much again, John. This is very inciting. And I can see already the question of what the Mau Mau would do if they came back. I think we have been told they will go straight to the forest. I think that's very exciting as well. Thank you very much. Thank you.
If time allows, can I offer a historian's comment? What I think faces Kenyans, what faces people all over the world probably, is the extraordinary change in economic factors over the past century or so. In 1900, people in Kenya had abundant land and a comparatively small population. And if you wanted to exploit land productively in 1900, if you wanted to exploit land productively, you had to recruit labor, clients, people who would work for you and for themselves for some kind of and it's the only way you could make land productive. As time went on, as land was taken, as population grew, as capitalism came in, then you could work the land with fewer people. You had less land to work. People became redundant, as such as they had never been before. And I think it's this transition, as much as anything, that Kenyans have to wrestle with. How does one achieve a moral economy where land can no longer be shared? And that is a hugely difficult question, which I think lies at the bottom of so many problems.
Questions and the response. Thank you, John.
My name is Mwai, not a historian, but whenever you talk about Mau Mau, I come and listen, because you'll be talking about me and my family. My father was arrested 6 months and 80 days before Kenyatta. The arrest started in April, and he was among the first 12. Now, in 1973, I went to study in England. And when I introduced, around that time, the British Council was also sponsoring students from Francophone Africa. And when I introduced myself to some Algerians who are in my university, a big group, they were so excited, went to me, hugged me, Mau Mau. And then I wondered, these are from French Algeria, and they know. Okay, I interrogated that one, and they told me the liberation of Algeria started in Kenya when you people shot at the British Empire. And it motivated the Algerians, and they started to believe it is possible to fight the French Empire. It forced me to kind of do a bit of questioning in my first year in university. There I met some old Britons who had some history of the empire. And I discovered another effect of Mau Mau that I think should be investigated. They motivated the whole colonized world when they shot at the empire that had just won the Second World War. How dare they? Talk of ANC, you find that motivation there in Sub-Saharan Africa. So there is a huge effect on the world by Mau Mau shooting at the British. Thank you very much. Yeah, wanted to make that. There will be more comments later about that.
Yes, madam. My name is Wahukara, and I am one of that Kenyan who has a passion of our history. And the Mau Mau history is a history that cannot be wished away. I want, first of all, to compliment the University of Nairobi for rising up and taking their rightful role as they have always done since we were young students. And now that we also must inspire the generations to go on. I hope this event is not just an occasion, but it's a one step that must go to very many steps. And what I have to put here about Mau Mau, it is the feared spirit of resilience for self-determination that threatens those who abuses justice for others, and especially when many of those who do not accept injustices organize and mobilize and say no, so spirited. So my challenge is to you scholars, because I don't know whether I can qualify to be one, but I want to tell you there is a lot of scholarly work going on where a knowledge system is usually lived and developed, and you come and research. And I'm glad you're observing, you research and write in your own perspectives. Perhaps we begin now to see how those who create that knowledge can also be participant when we come to put these knowledge systems to good stewardship for use and also for prosperity. So my only concern is you scholars, because you have this privilege, kindly do help us to redefine what justice is and what injustice is in retrospective of this very spirited resilient, because it's a spirit for self-determination. And that is what I think we are lacking in our world today. And I think today you are saying we can. Thank you very much.
The ladies in the room, anyone who'd like to raise a question or an issue? right? If there is none, we'll have one last intervention. I hope it's a question, and then we'll have a summary appreciations by the two scholars.
Thank you very much, the two presenters, the eminent professors. Mine is a very brief question. It seems the land question is the elephant in the house or in the room. So if you look at the characteristics of Mau Mau and the characteristics of Mungiki, they seem to be closely related. So my question is to the two professors, is Mungiki a reincarnation of Mau Mau? Thank you.
So a number of the questions that have been asked and the comments will be responded to as we get along in the coming several hours. But more fundamentally, it's really a question of whether the historians, as you've been asked, you can then reignite that fundamental question in terms of how we should define justice. And two, whether in fact, I mean, in an agrarian society, what is the fundamental role of land? It's a mode of production. So I think we all understand that bit, but the question is, where do we then head to, given the fact of the scarcity of that resource and the structure around which it is built within our republic? You'll probably notice that in the case of the British, it was much more easier to come over here and get all of land, 5 million hectares. But so in the case of Kenya, what do you do with respect to that? So very quick responses from our two presenters, and then I will certainly hand the microphone back to the chair, please.
Is it my turn? We live, and Kenyans live, as Britons do too, in extraordinarily difficult circumstances in which cultures that were formed under very different circumstances face extraordinary change. And I come back to what I said before, was that before colonial, to gain wealth from land, you be kind to labor by giving it its rights of tenancy, rights of clientship, converted to self-mastery, to wiadi. As time has changed, as capitalism has ruled the world, rather more than imperialism has, as populations have increased, as land has become scarce, we somehow devise societies where that justice, which used to have to be meted out to scarce labor, if it was to work for you at all, where that kind of justice has to be available to people who cannot get access to land, who have not themselves got capital, but for whom capitalism must be put to work with justice rather than with sorcery. And I do think that we live and Kenyans perhaps particularly, in a situation of cultural change, where justice has to be applied under very different circumstances under which it was first conceived.
Thank you very much. There was a question of whether Mungiki is a reincarnation of the Mau Mau. And I think this is a question we may want to answer towards the end of the week. The conditions under which Mungiki was arising could be slightly different, but not radically different from what gave rise to Mau Mau, except that at the start, been informed by very different type of cases coming from the whole question of land dispossession in the Rift Valley, the question of socio-cultural revolution within the Kikuyu areas, and so on and so forth. So those are some of the issues we may want to deal with towards the end. But going back to the question of knowledge production on Mau Mau, John, I think what has made this even more difficult among Kenyan scholars was the civil war within the Department of History. When I was a young student, William eye to eye with radical historians in the department. In fact, it was always physical confrontation. I think Ephraim Wahome would remember when we went for a lecture at Stella Winja Hall. At night, stones were being thrown simply because of William Ochieng branding other scholars of history as conservative, and they didn't like the way the history of the Mau Mau was being looked at, because he was very dismissive of the Mau Mau, I must admit. I think it's gone, George Gona. I mean, it's Ephraim, it's George Gona. George Gona. Way back in 1985, William Ochieng was not seeing eye to eye with the other historians. And from then onwards, I think we had very divided opinion on even how to, and I can admit that even our Africana was not very effectively utilized. The material in Africana was not effectively utilized because it depended on which articles are you reading, which historical association documents are you referring to, who was present in that particular meeting. So I think we began also with a very bifurcated approach to the studies of Mau Mau among the Kenyan historians themselves, and I think we did not do good justice to the study of Mau Mau. The second thing is even the peasant question. I think Mukarunganga and Nyang'yo also had a civil war of some kind, which led even to Mukarunganga being expelled from history department and told that he needs to get a home in political science. And when he came to political science said, no, go back, you are a political historian. And when he went back to history, they told him, no, you are a political scientist. And it's simply because of the way he looked at the peasant question and the kind of Marxist lenses he was using, which some colleagues in the history department were not comfortable with. So the discomfort within the disciplines also created an attitude that made it extremely difficult to a radical thought on the study of Mau Mau within the University of Nairobi. And that's where the question of identity of outside scholars comes in. That's why outside scholarship was much more appreciated than internal production of knowledge because of the civil war that we were experiencing. I think I would like to announce that I'm not that old, so I was only reading the history of that particular time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Interventions, both Professor Kanyinga and Lonsdale. A lot of thanks and a lot of appreciations. Appreciations to all of you for your participations. We hope you still spare some bit of more time in the afternoon and all that. A lot of thanks to the Vice Chancellor. I hope you really understood and appreciated the kind of fights that we had over there. I'm hoping the Dean will be able to create the conditions within which we do not necessarily have to agree, but continue to exchange all these issues together. The other lady was talking about the role of historians in the Society of the Republic. They have had your question. We will answer some of those questions along the way. Santeni Sana, I am handing over power.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, colleague. Professor Mzambai was my classmate, so I sometimes bully him. So that's why he's here. We were classmates all along. The controversy went beyond the Department of History, touched the Department of Literature. For those colleagues from literature who are here, if you remember, Professor Ngulu Wathiongo dismissed some historians in our department as mere chroniclers or bourgeois historians. And then the fight went on for very long. Thank you, Professor Kanyinga and Professor John Lonsdale. Both of them were my teachers at different times. Professor Kanyinga taught me here, just like Professor Macharia, they radicalized us a little bit. And then when I was much older, I encountered Professor Lonsdale, in the University of Cambridge during my PhD days. So thank you, Prof. And thank you for allowing me to harass you most of the time, Professor Lonsdale and Kanyinga, for being there for us. Thank you, Prof. I think we are increasingly reporting you from veterinary medicine to history. We probably want to urge you to consider, after your tour of duty as the VC, we will create an office at 4th floor of Mahatma Gandhi for you, because as I listened to you, I was more of listening to a historian than a scientist. So thank you very much. Professor Munyoki, Professor Munyoki, thank you very much for standing in the gap for our Associate Vice Chancellor Research, and for very ably representing her in this occasion. Our Dean, Prof, thank you so much for being handy and being there for us. And this week I've really harassed you, including having you in a meeting yesterday, but you have seen the fruits of that. And all my colleagues who are here, we appreciate you. It is lunchtime. I don't want to be a bottleneck between you and lunch. But allow me to mention that Mr. Mwai Kihu is the Vice Chair of the Kenya India Friendship Association, KIFA, and I'm his chairman. So we crack a joke and say, my subject, welcome. Welcome. And I hope that in future, you will support me strongly so that we can sponsor functions like this from KIFA. We have a few shillings there which we can use for functions like this, and I hope when I bring this up in the executive committee, you will stand with and by me, and I hope you hear me. Also, we want to serve some light lunch. It delayed a bit at the roundabout. We are stuck there, but I'm sure they are setting up. And I want to mention that the lunch has been provided by actually one of the members of the Kenya India Friendship Association, Mrs. Yogini Brabu. She has provided us this lunch, our VC, at cost. And that is very kind of her. And our restaurant is called Ailaji Restaurant, which is in the Sky Mall, High Ridge, for those of you who understand the geography of Nairobi. When you are around there, they are wonderful people. Please pass by there and support them the way they have supported us in the hour of need. And finally, I will want to mention a few of our partners who also supported us in one way or the other. Allow me to begin with the British Institute in Eastern Africa, British Institute for History and Archaeological Research. Little money that has enabled us to actually sponsor students to this conference. Both a number of students who are online from Uganda and Tanzania, and those of our students who are here were actually sponsored to this conference by the British Institute, and we appreciate it. There are those of our partners who came in to exhibit. I will begin with the British Colonial Museum. We are going to hear just something small about them for 5 minutes in the afternoon. We appreciate them. Mr. Kipachi Agatu, who is here, is, yes, there he is one of our exhibitors here and a very passionate historian. You were saying you are not one. When I listened to you, I can hear a strong historian. Our very good friends and partners, Madam Zarina Batal, and my very good friend and brother, they're here, Zahid Ranjani, people we call upon at a very short time, and they respond. Thank you very much. They're one of our exhibitors. Please, when you go out, pass by their stand and see a very wonderful work that they do in scholarship, actually. They publish a magazine called Awas, which handles very interesting contemporary and historical issues. I receive a copy every so often, and it's an interesting read. The University of Nairobi bookshop we are there here. Please pass by there. They are supporting this by exhibiting in our conference. We have the Department of Art and Design within the Faculty of Built Environment. They came in very strongly. My very dear colleague, Beatrice Koech, and the chairman of the Department of Art and Design, Dr. Maina, they came in very handy and supported us. Corporate communications, my very good brother, Mr. John Orindi, very, very, very supportive. Our Department of Maintenance came in handy also, and our colleagues and administrators from different units who supported us here. I want to appreciate you at the earliest opportunity and in the presence of our VC. That is why I said, when a VC, that when I see colleagues coming in and supporting, it gives me hope that the University of Nairobi, we are there for many years to come. Thank you. Our lunch is served. They are setting up. Don't go away. It's a light lunch for academics to come back and listen to Professor Macharia Munene, who is going to open our afternoon session. Thank you, and God bless you all.